Right, and we should be on the air.
Live broadcasting.
Fantastic.
Good evening, Haere mai, and a warm welcome to everybody. This is the Let's Get Accessible event for Techweek 2020. We'd like to just do some thank yous first of all. We'd first like to thank Intopia for actually hosting the event and making it possible, and for also sponsoring the live captioning service that we'll have this evening. I'm Zoe Horton. I'll be your host this evening, and we have a fantastic lineup of speakers presenting on a range of topics on digital accessibility. But first of all, we're going to do some introductions to just a handful of our organisers and supporters for the event this evening. So first up, Sarah, would you like to tell us a bit about yourself and what you do and why digital accessibility is so important to you?
Absolutely. Wow, which hat shall I start with? I'm one of the directors and co-founders of Intopia, and of the wonderful team that helps organisations make digital products more accessible. I also am one of the co-organisers of the Sydney Web Accessibility and Inclusive Design Meetup. We have our meetup tomorrow night for July, and also help to organise Ali Bites, which some of you may have tuned into for Global Accessibility Awareness Day in May, and also Ali Camp, which is a conference that came out of Ali Bites. Why accessibility? Why not? I think I still remember my aha moment, which was about 20 years ago, where I observed someone demonstrating a screen reader on a map of Australia, and you had to choose the state in order to then search for a rental property, and it was completely and utterly inaccessible. And that stuck with me for the 20 odd years since I saw that, and 10 years ago I was able to move into accessibility full time. So that's always stuck with me, and to me it's just about creating wonderful, delightful experiences for everyone.
That's great, thank you. Next over we have Lauren Highland. She's one of the co-organisers of the Auckland Meetup group. Over to you, Lauren.
Fantastic, thank you, Zoe, and thank you all for joining tonight. So my name's Lauren, and I'm a service designer and interaction designer at a company called Essentia, who are a global consultancy. And within Essentia, I'm part of our design team called Fjord. And I actually started my journey with accessibility through studying industrial design. And it was about looking at kind of the human-centered principles that we could apply to designing physical products and kind of catering those physical products to different needs and abilities. And when I kind of gradually transitioned into a digital world, I started looking at how do those principles apply into the digital space, and that got me curious about this and connected out and to see what kind of was happening in the Auckland space in kind of a meetup capacity, and connected with the likes of Zoe and Intopia, as well as a few others who are really passionate about it, to help set up the meetup, and we've been involved since.
And we couldn't do it without you.
Yeah, thank you. And I just wanted to mention that I'll be managing the Q&A panel this evening. So if any of you have questions that you want to ask the speakers tonight, feel free to drop that into the Q&A panel, and we'll have a little bit of time after each session to ask questions. So thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. And last but not least, we have Sam Taylor. So over to you, Sam. Would you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me here. We're very excited to be here and supporting the event. I am a organizer, navigator of the Tech for Good New Zealand group, which is a meetup group and a community really focused on connecting the tech sector with the social sector to help create that meaningful change and impact. We primarily run events and workshops, and I guess we're currently building that online community, so please look for us and come find us on either just techforgood.nz or on the Meetup platform. And I guess accessibility is something I'm personally a huge advocate for, and something Tech for Good has been supporting as well. We've run a number of events already, and like the others have said, I just really think it's about creating great user experiences for everyone. I don't think it should be something that's thought about after the fact. It just needs to become a natural part of the way we build products and design. So really excited to hear from everyone here tonight, and thank you again.
Thank you, Sam. Okay, so that's our introductions to our wonderful supporters and co-organizers. So we're waiting on our first speaker. It's due to start in about 5 minutes, so we can maybe just take a break until the speaker is online with us. And so please feel free to just hide your cameras. You don't have to stay online, and we'll be back in a few minutes when Minnie's online. Okay, I think we should actually just shuffle around the speakers a little bit. So hopefully once our first speaker has managed to get online, we can just slot in then. So let's move to Gareth Ford Williams. I'd like to introduce Gareth Ford Williams. His topic is moving from accessibility guidelines to documentation-driven development.
Hi, good. I'm still completely confused by the whole good evening thing. So I'm presenting from Dorset in South England. I'm on a holiday and it's 7:30 in the morning. So forgive me if I'm slightly fuzzy. Yeah. But yeah, hello everyone. Let me just do my screen share. Let's get this right. PowerPoint, share that. Can everyone see that? And does that make sense? Is that okay, Zoe?
Yes, we can see that. Yeah, and
lovely.
We're auto recording these presentations in the cloud as well.
Oh, fabulous, fabulous. Right, I've just started my timer to make sure I don't waffle on too long. So hi everyone. Yeah, I'm Gareth Ford Williams. So I'm one of there are actually 7 heads of design at the BBC who manage a team of about 250 UX designers. But within that team, I manage 2 accessibility teams. There's an internally facing one, which deals with all of the needs of our there's 18,000 members of staff at the BBC, but we have a lot of disabled members of staff. So we look at the assistive technology side, and I also manage the accessibility team, which is the work of which I'm going to talk about this evening. I set that team up 15 years ago at the BBC. It's not the only thing around accessibility I get involved in. I'm also a member of a group that's doing research into accessible fonts. It's called the Readability Group. I also do accessibility guidelines, gamesaccessibilityguidelines.com, one of the co-authors of that, and a judge at the Tech for Good Awards. So it's good to hear from someone else doing Tech for Good on the other side of the world as well. So, which is great. So little bit about digital accessibility at the BBC. BBC's got a long history around accessibility. So we did our first InVision signing for broadcast television in 1957. In the early 1970s, we pioneered closed captions for television, which launched in 1979. And the 1990s, we were part of a consortium that pioneered audio description for television as well. So, you know, it was a real natural thing that, I mean, I got involved in a team, which was where I set up the accessibility team in a project 2005, which launched its product in 2007, which was called the iPlayer. So we built the iPlayer to be completely accessible from day one. We learned everything we could in those 2 years about accessibility, and then started applying it out to the other products. As you know, internationally, we have an audience of about 500 million people. It's a huge, yeah, and we're publishing thousands of pages of content in 44 languages a day. It's an enormous, enormous organization. So we have a very small accessibility team. There's only 7 of us. There's myself, top left. There's Becky Nancaro, Charlie Turrell, and Alice Whittle, who are all change managers and project managers. And then Jamie Knight and Lion, who comes with Jamie. Some of you may have heard Jamie before. Emma Pratt-Richards and Michael Matthews, who are all research engineers who work within the team. We don't do auditing. I haven't done any auditing for nearly 8 years now. I don't really believe in it. I think we have a very different approach to accessibility, and I'll go into a little bit about that. But yes, we're part of the UX team. It's quite an, for me, quite an obvious place for an accessibility team to sit, because UX function is horizontal, accessibility is horizontal function in an organization. And pretty much, and I'll say, inaccessibility starts with design, not accessibility starts with design. Accessibility is often treated as a thing that is designed and built. It's not. It's broken by bad decisions. When something is an abstract concept, it's accessible to everyone because we can all imagine it. As soon as we start making decisions, right in the early days in the design, we start filtering people out. And that's where we stop that from happening. So everyone is trained, everyone is supported, and GEL, which is our global experience language, which is, you know, our design language for the BBC, has accessibility built into it. We also have our standards and guidelines. Now, standards and guidelines are a funny thing. We have our own. They're a version of WCAG, and they're based largely on WCAG, but then they're contextualized to the way that we do things. And originally, we used to use these as an actual tool. We redesigned our own because WCAG, although it is phenomenally useful, it's totally unusable. It's very, very, very difficult until you've memorized the whole of it. Every time you start anything, you've got to read it all to try and work out what it is that you're supposed to be doing. And so we realized that this was just a massive time suck for everyone. And people got confused, and which bit should I be considering, and how and where. So we rewrote it in a friendlier way. Made sense. So, you know, you'd have your your rationale, your guideline, reference implementations and tests on every single one. But we don't really use this. This is now really more of a reflection of what we do rather than, you know, a thing that we do. Instead, we're moving towards documentation-driven development. Documentation-driven development is, instead of, say, if you want to build a promo, we have a promo document. And literally you go and pick up the promo document, and the document teaches you how to build an accessible promo. It's not a code library. I'm not really a great fan of code libraries when it comes down to accessibility and doing stuff. Code libraries should be owned by the products. They should be owned by the engineers. The decision of what their code is should be up to them, but how it behaves should be determined by accessibility. You know, you need to be able to give them reference implementations, which we have. If you go and have a look at this, and Zoe, if you can share the URL, that'd be brilliant. But you can go and have a look at it, and there's reference implementations. You can run your code against the reference code. We're going to put test scripts in here as well. So you can build it how on earth you want. As long as it behaves correctly for the end user, we're happy. So if you want to use React or Angular or anything you want to do, you're going to make it very difficult for yourself, but it's still possible, and you can still make it accessible. And so we found that actually this has cut down time to, you know, down to a third of it was to develop components. And so everyone who builds a library is what our intention is, use these development. So the slide says we've made 15 years of mistakes, so you don't have to. We also made some discoveries on the way. It's an interesting situation how we've got to kind of moving away from guidelines to documentation, because literally we've tried out so many things that have gone horribly wrong over the years, and the organisation has allowed us to do this. It's big on R&D, is the BBC, and obviously it's pioneered access services for television in the past. And so it wanted to pioneer digital. So we tried everything from, building tools into web pages that customized pages, and decided they were a really bad idea because customization should happen at the operating system level. And we support it and build everything to support the operating system level choices. And there are numerous others, but yeah, auditing. I know. I'll come back to auditing on this. I think there's a couple of good examples here. So auditing, we find, I think the philosophy really is don't break it in the first place, and you don't need to audit it. And if you're planning to audit it, then you're planning to break it. Audit to learn. Audit all of your labeling conventions to find out that you're doing them in consistent ways. That's a useful audit. When we did that across our estate, we found we called the play button 5 different things. So we all sat down in a room and went, let's call it one thing, shall we, and make it a little bit more usable for our audience. We all decided on one label, and bingo, that was a really useful audit. But if you're auditing as part of your development process, it can be very, very, very difficult to do stuff, and it's very, very hard to get it right, because you're loading it on the back, front load accessibility at the beginning. The other one is gaming. We produced loads of children's games on our children's services, and we used to make games, mainstream games, and accessible games. So that we discovered that was a really bad idea, because then when we spent some time basically listening to children, they talk about the games that they play all the time, and we realized that we were segregating children by doing 2 sets of games. And so we've moved everything to our own gaming guidelines and our own process to make inclusive games, so as many children as possible can play every game that we produce. So therefore, social currency is created, and you're creating a cohesion, and you're not leaving any children out of the fun and out of the conversation by doing that. So having said that, we do make mistakes, we even when we're pioneering stuff and doing stuff really well on our closed captioning here, we've got a little caption underneath our previous Prime Minister saying, "Prime Minister, I'm eating the First Minister of Scotland." Things go wrong. And I think in accessibility terms, and particularly this process that we're moving into as documentation driven, it's okay to make mistakes, as long as you learn from them, as long as you observe them, as long as you acknowledge them, as long as you talk to the people who are at the receiving end of them and understand the user experience, and then you sit down and go, right, how do we mitigate against this? And accessibility is an organic thing, and it grows, and the documents that we're building are living documentation, and they will grow. So as I said before, exclusion rather than inclusion comes from poor design or technical decisions. We've tried to take a sort of social model around the way that we're approaching this. People I always like the way it's termed, that people are not disabled, but they're disabled by the things around them that have been badly designed. And that's kind of where we're trying to move from, is that we're trying to move from move to a model where we're just saying, look, everyone should be able to access something in its default state as widely as possible, and we're going to make the right decisions to make sure that we don't exclude people. And one of the things that's happening as part of this process, moving into a more documentation driven and behavioral driven development, which is more around the culture that's being developed around accessibility, is asking always two awkward questions at the beginning when starting to build stuff. Who are you willing to exclude? It sounds terribly loaded, which it is in a way, but it's actually a really practical question to ask. Before you build anything, when you're writing your requirements, actually sit down with the whole team and say, who are we willing to exclude? Are you willing, if this is an English language service, you're going to exclude people who can only speak Chinese? It's a practical thing, unless you just turn around and say, well, there's Google Translate and stuff, but we're not going to build to that. We're not going to test to that. What about, you know, Opera browsers with 240 pixel wide screens on feature phones? Are we going to do that? Are we going to support Netscape? You know, Mosaic? You know, you are going to have practical questions. They're a bit extreme, those, but it's really good to do that, because if you turn around and say, well, there are groups of people we're not going to exclude, every decision that you make, you look back and go, well, I exclude them. and it gives you a good benchmark of maybe we shouldn't make that decision if it's going to have a really negative impact. And then also the one is who gets the full experience. And by that, it's like the full JavaScript experience. Who gets the full back experience? You know, you're always going to have legacy devices, legacy assistive technologies, legacy platforms. You want to fall back to something that they can support. And a good example of that for us is by building using progressive enhancement to be able to build that fallback experience. During the 2012 Olympics, literally on the launch day, we had a huge failure on our results table, and on the day of the opening of the Olympics. And it was this full JavaScript experience. It was completely accessible. We tested it to death. It was fantastic. And the whole thing failed. It fell back to the HTML, which worked perfectly well as a results table. Again, really good on accessibility. But it meant that no one lost anything. And actually, we decided not to fix it and left the HTML one up for the entirety of the rest of the Olympics. And nobody noticed because you've always got this fallback to the HTML experience. Multimodality, I'm just going to rattle through a few things. I think these are things that you always need to consider and what we've built into our documents. Oh, suddenly got a noise, but sorry. So multimodality is something that we kind of build into everything that we do. We always try and think of it, and you think multimodality has sort of come into UX quite recently, but I think if you work in accessibility, you've been talking about this for 20 odd years. You know, if you can't see it, you can feel it through your braille display or hear it. If you can't hear it, you can read it. Think of everything in a multimodal context. One of the things I always think around that is, you know, that comes from our TV access services background. We have 4 TV access services, though people only ever talk about 3. So subtitles for me is just, you know, that's just like sound and pictures. It's a fundamental that should be on everything. And these days now it's mainstream. It's not about hearing impairment. It's about situational accessibility. You know, people are now accessing, you know, social media content in loads of different places. And, you know, you just look at Twitter and Facebook's statistics, and like 80% of all videos are watched with the sound switched off. So if you ain't subtitling it, you're cutting out a huge amount of your audience. But the fourth one is a thing we call bimedia production, which we've been doing since the 90s. And so literally is try and script your videos as if they've got no pictures. If you write a radio script and then film it, you then don't need to audio describe it because it completely works without the pictures. It's an incredibly cost-effective way of making things accessible to people who are visually impaired. Great example of that is Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which was actually a radio script that they end up filming, and so it was never needed to be audio described. Knowledge is a huge thing that we're doing through this. So the things that we're writing all our documentation as training documents, and they're written in the style of training documents. So you're using the document and learning about accessibility at the same time. And eventually you won't need the document because you'll know how to build accessible promos or everything about accessible forms, etc. The resources themselves as well are so important. So not only do we support accessibility in this way through the resources we're giving us with the documents, that there are other resources that we do. So we spend a lot of time looking at tooling and ways of enabling it. So accessibility, if accessibility is easy, people are going to do it. And if they've got good resources and a limited and focused amount of resources, then they're going to do it well. And they know exactly how to use them. And so we teach everyone how to use screen readers, but screen readers, we teach it as how to use screen readers as a testing tool if you're a tester, how to use it as a design tool if you're a designer, how to use it, you know, as a development tool as if you're a developer, and give them resources and contextualize them to their job. You'll end up finding that accessibility ends up becoming self-sustaining in this way. And there are tons of different ways in which accessibility actually pays for itself. You know, I've talked about the social media subtitles. You know, it's just reach. It actually, by doing it this way, moving to develop documentation-driven development, we were actually reducing developer time. We're handing resource back to the business, which actually pays for the entire operation. You're improving search engine optimization. You're actually improving UX for everyone. And it actually makes things more robust, and that's where the 2012 Olympics comes in. You know, so if something fails, bingo, you've already got the screen reader UX. There's a chap called Ian Pouncey, who's a brilliant accessibility specialist who I've worked with in the past, and he always says that HTML is screen reader UX. And so, you know, that's, you end up with the UX for everyone. So the screen reader support actually saved our bacon on that time. And the last slide I've got is it's all about culture. So one of the things is the reason why I have 2 change managers and a project manager in the core part of the accessibility team is that, you know, we're now in our 10th year of having an accessibility champions network that it's building the culture and the discussion of accessibility in the organization. I always say, why have a team when you can have an army? And I've got an army of over 200 accessibility champions who just simply, their one role is in every sprint, in every project, they just say, what does this mean for accessibility? How do we make this accessible? And they can be business analysts, developers, designers, testers, product managers, all sorts of people who just want to get involved. They all volunteer, they become part of the network, we train them in their role. They become the go-to person. They have a Slack channel, they all chat amongst each other and have a tendency of fixing each other's problems for us, which makes us fairly redundant at times. But that's great. It's culture that's underneath this. And if it isn't there within the culture, you're always going to have a fight. So thank you very much. I think I might have overrun by a couple of minutes. I apologize for that. But any questions?
We'll just let the attendees know that to ask the questions, there's a Q&A functionality at the bottom of the screen. So please feel free to type in your questions for Gareth there. Otherwise, if our panelists have any questions for Gareth, feel welcome. I know I have a question for you, Gareth. What challenges do you see on the web for, I know that you have dyslexia and ADHD. I just wonder, what challenges do you see on the web for such users? And is there a way that you would recommend that we design to be inclusive of those users?
There's a lot of things. I'll actually kind of reverse that question. I think there's a lot of things that present themselves as fixes around ADHD and dyslexia that you should be more wary of. You know, accessible fonts. Right. Okay. So this is something I've been doing research, and I've been working in design for donkey's years, by the way, before I became an accessibility specialist. My background's sort of art and design. But I also love data. I love looking at data. Anecdote gives you really good questions. And so when people come up with anecdotes and become with insights, then it should lead you to research questions. But data gives you answers. And for all of the accessible fonts out there, I'll call accessible in quote marks, I've never yet find any data that supports any of their claims. They usually, like my mate Kevin says it's great, and then suddenly it's an accessible font. And, you know, I don't care what Kevin says. So we're doing, I mean, we've done our own BBC Wreath, which is, we've learnt an enormous amount by building the BBC's own font. We tested it to death with vision impairment and in loads of different contexts. And we learned so much about accessibility with fonts, and it's incredibly complicated. There's lots of people read in different ways. So that's one of those, it's not a fix-all. You know, and some of them just make your site ugly. I think that's, you know, and I think there's a guy called Bruno Mag who talks about emotional accessibility, and which is quite true. I remember, I hope you don't mind if I swear a bit, but I remember meeting this young chap many years ago when I worked. I was on Attachment to YouView, which is a TV platform, and which the BBC was part of building, and I was sort of leading accessibility there for 2 years, and I met this young chap, a teenager, and he used a speech synthesizer, and he had lots of stuff attached to his chair. We were having a natter. I asked him about his equipment, and you know, and he said he hated it because it made him look like a wanker. And I looked at it and I thought, yeah, you're a teenage kid and everything looked like it made by Fisher Price. And you know, and there is an emotional accessibility. He wanted Apple, he wanted cool stuff on his chair. You know, I wanted all of that stuff because he was, you know, he's a teenage kid, he's self-conscious, you know. And I think there's this whole thing is, you know, people want stuff that they can relate to, that feels good about themselves. And I've kind of drifted off on that, but I think it's also, you know, these whole things about, you know, fixing stuff with color, fixing stuff in different ways. It's I always put myself as a slightly lower concern than other people, because often when you're looking at low contrast versus high contrast, there's a difference between a barrier and a less usable experience. And for me, I'm more interested in barriers. Mostly less usable experiences can be hacked by the user. You know, for instance, you know, I can turn contrast down by literally reducing the brightness of my screen, and I can change style. I can do stuff really, really easily to make things more readable or less, you know, because I have a little bit of Erlins going on and other stuff going on. So that's where that visual, you know, comfort level stuff, I can fix that really simple myself. But you can't turn, it's really, really hard to turn contrast up. You know, so it's more of a barrier for someone with a vision impairment than it was some. So you make decisions based on the level when things can conflict.
Thank you.
So sorry about that. It's kind of gone slightly, but that's the ADHD for you folks.
That's okay. We've had quite a few more questions coming through. So Lauren, are there any questions?
Yes. There's been some great questions coming through. I'll just ask the question from Natalie about how much buy-in did you need from upper leadership to embed accessibility as part of your process?
That's an interesting one. I am at the moment trying to remove share screen. Right, back again. Yes, you really need to go and talk to people about it. And I mean, most people, if they are struggling with supporting it, they're struggling to understand it. And I think if you're dealing with accessibility in an organization, you need to make it understood what it actually is. You need to change the view, because a lot of people think it's a worthy thing and it's going to be expensive and this, that, and the other. It's not. It's worthwhile. You need to change their view round. And there's lots of good ways of doing that. I think there's that there's always that thing of, isn't it expensive? I think it's one of the big challenges. I mean, the amount of people in the past, someone goes, well, we can't afford to do it. And I've asked to have a look at their balance sheet, because they must have costed it. To understand that it's expensive, they must have some idea, and then say, can I have a look at your costings and let's see what we can do that might be free or good, or let's move it on a little bit. It's funny, no one's ever managed to bring up a balance sheet and showed me that they've done the costings, because they've never done the work. They've always got it in their head. But if you offset stuff against the benefits, so for instance, you know, just look at Twitter and Facebook statistics on caption consumption, and just say our videos are being shared on social media, and if we're not captioning them, 80% of the social media audience is not going to use it because they view it with the sound switched off. You know, you find those practical things. You know, color contrast is a really simple one to deal with, because color contrast impacts on everyone. And so color contrast is, for me, it's about using mobile phones in sunshine. So most people, when they want to save battery, they turn the brightness down on their phone, then they go and use it in bright light and ambient spaces. If you're not high contrast, they can't read your content anymore. And so it's a situational and environmental accessibility problem. And so if you pick all of these things and give those kind of really broad benefit things, it's amazing how the conversation switches from why should we do this is why aren't we doing this, because this just sounds like good design.
Thank you.
And so it's that. Sorry, yeah, rattling on. That's a whole other talk.
Thank you. We've probably got time just for one more question. Lauren?
Sure. So this one is, what is the best way to go about setting up an accessibility army in a business?
I'll tell you the way I did it. I just got permission to email the whole of my division, because we used to basically be all in one part of the UK, and we're now spread all over. But 15 years ago, we were all based in one area, and I just said, look, can I send out an email to the whole division just saying, I'm going to be sat in the boardroom with some free sandwiches and tea this one lunchtime, and if you're interested, just rock up. And I just literally, that's how we started, and that was 2005. I sent out that email, and there was a queue outside because I couldn't fit everyone in, and literally all these people turned up. Most of them didn't know anything about it, but they were interested in it. And so I found out who everyone was, what they did, and then we started going, right, okay, what decisions do we need to make? What's the plan? And literally we had one plan to start off with, which was actually agree how we were going to do heading structure. And it took us 3 months to describe that there was going to be one heading level 1 on every page and what it did. And literally that army was the first thing. That was our first decision that we made across the organization. And then we found another challenge and another challenge, and we all implemented it. And so we changed the way that we did things slowly. But literally just find all the people that are interested, invite them along. You know, free cake and tea goes a long way.
Thanks very much, Gareth, for that. That was a wonderful talk. I'm sure everybody would agree. Very inspiring and motivational. And yeah, the takeaway for me was that inaccessibility starts with design. It's a really, really great point. Thank you so much for your presentation and your time. So we're going to go on now to our next speaker. So we're going to go to Kylee. Kylee Maloney. She's a professional speaker and communicator at inclusive events and accessible documents. And her topic is Even Ode Typists. Over to you, Kylee.
Thank you very much, Zoe. I just needed to start my timer. You may have wondered why you can't see me. Well, I can't see you, so hey, we're equal tonight. But you hopefully will be able to hear me, and if you can't hear me, you will be having the caption service, and in a minute I'll be sharing my screen. If you'll just... Here we go. You know, in life, there's always one, isn't there? The wasp in the jam, the dissenting voice, the stubborn as a rock person who you have to go around in order to make any progress. Well, that used to be me when it came to inclusive document design, and you may wonder about that because I'm totally blind. Why on earth wouldn't I? Well, because I was a typist and I was well trained, and I resented the fact that my skills were not being needed any longer. So I clung to the 2 spaces after a full stop or a colon or the courier type fonts, all those sort of things that I'd been trained on, and the direct coding of headings. So tonight's talk really isn't going to give you all the answers about accessible document design. I can't. I've only got 10 minutes. What I hope to do is to tell you how I overcame my intransigence, tell you what you're fighting against, which is why accessible document design isn't particularly as well known as it might be. And as you can see down the bottom there, I'm on a mission to include everyone so that everything you write eventually would be accessible. That's why I said if you write, you need this. And give you just a toe in the water, introduce you to how accessible document design works. So how did I overcome my intransigence? Well, there are 3 ways to do it, and they are the standard ways, the standard elements of persuasion, I suppose you would say, from Aristotle. And we tend to use the first 2 in accessible arguments on accessibility. Pathos, of course, is the emotion. Oh, these people are missing out and you can't do that. That isn't right. Well, of course, that's valid. Or this is the right thing to do because it's good design. Gareth was just talking about good design, good practice. But I think there are some logical and technical reasons why we don't do document design inclusively. And I think there's one thing to blame about this. It's the past's fault. Blame the past. Because for 5 millennia, we've been writing like this. Pen on paper, stylus on tablet, chisel on tablet of stone, whatever. For 5,000 years, give or take, we've been writing by using a tool on a surface, and it doesn't matter what surface or what tool, you're limited by what you can do with those tools. And when we wanted to change a font or make a heading or something, we've just changed it on the fly, haven't we? And that's all been very fine, except the computer came along and things have changed. What I'm going to do now is just pause the share and keep on talking while we transfer to Microsoft Word so that I can show you what I mean. And you will start to hear JAWS, my screen reader. So I'll pause the share. Have I stopped sharing?
Not quite.
Ah, that's why. That's it. That's better. It helps to move to the right window, doesn't it? Okay.
So you're not sharing anything now, Kylie?
That's fine, yes.
It's probably the intention.
Okay, let's restart the share, and this time you will hear the sound of my screen reader.
Started screen share. Meeting controls.
I suppose you heard that. That is the sound of my screen reader. So you'll not only see me, but hopefully you'll hear, if you can hear, what I hear. I'm now going to go back into
Desktop. Folder view list view. Zoom. 32 of the.
Let's have a bit of a play.
Context menu. O. Open. O. Leaving menus. Folder view. Window list. Even old typist. Handout 1 docs word. Even old typist. Handout 0 docs word. Even old typist. Handout 0 doc. Menu. Leaving menus. Edit.
This, as you can see, is a block of text. Imagine if this text, which is only a few hundred words, was a few 100,000 words, and you had to navigate it. No index, no table of contents, and no headings. Believe it or not, I get presented with the equivalent of that often. I could read it from cover to cover, but that's all I could use it for. It wouldn't be actually usable, it will only be readable. And what tends to happen, because we've written in this way that we've been doing for 5,000 years, we tend to do this.
Even old typists. Even old typists.
Add a bit of bold, right? There's a problem with that. There's a couple of problems.
If you write even old typists.
Firstly, I can press undo.
Even old typists.
And
ellipse typists. Old. Even. 12 point. Default.
It's undone it. But if I had saved, like if I do this again.
Even old typists. On.
And then I save. Now, let me try and...
Even. Old. Even.
I can't undo, but I could try clearing the formatting by going to the home.
Upper ribbon. Ribbon. Leaving menus. Leaving ribbons. Edit. V. E. 12 point. Default on default. Arial. Normal style. Line spacing. Single. Pair.
That works, but sometimes it doesn't, and it's not guaranteed to take it away from you. So what you're actually dealing with is the old tablet of stone or something similar, because it's not guaranteed.
Even old.
Let's go to a different version of this handout and I'll show you what I mean. Because the other problem's an even bigger one to my mind.
Window list dialog. Running up. Even old typist. Handout 1 docs word minimized. Even old typist. Handout 1 docs word. Edit. Menu. Syst. Leaving menus. Menu. Expand collapse submenu. Expand collapse submenu. Leaving menus. Window list. Even old typist. Handout 2 docs word minimum. Even old typist. Handout 2 doc menu. Leaving menus. Edit.
Right. Let's have a look at these two documents.
Even old typist. Handout 1 docs word. Even old typist. Handout 1.
1 and 2. Handout 1 and 2. They both look similar, don't they? You might think that I actually duplicated them by mistake. When I first did this once, a friend of mine actually swore in front of the presentation, it was a live one, face-to-face, not online, as it is now, that I had actually done that. But let me show you this.
Heading level 1 even old typists.
JAWS is telling me it's a heading. And if I wanted to prove that, I could just have a look here.
Heading list dialog. Headings
And
list.
move
If you
down to the
direct
headings
right,
with
stone tap,
JAWS.
the confused computer.
Could
Edit.
do that. Now, let me go to the other version.
Even old typist handout 2 docs word. Even old typists.
That looks like a heading to you, doesn't it? It's got bold and all that, except the computer, i.e. JAWS, and JAWS is part of the computer. It's a piece of software on the computer, so it only knows what the computer knows, doesn't know the difference. It thinks this.
Bolded, 18 point, default on default, Tahoma, normal style, line spacing, single, paragraph formatting, aligned left, outline level, body text.
Outline level body text, but your eyes can see it's a heading, but it's not. The computer thinks it's not a heading, even though you've made it one, and your eyes can see that it is. That's where you start to confuse your machine. And why is that important? Because if you try to be multimodal, as Gareth suggested, you're not going to be able to be. Because if you have a good foundation document with all the things built in, such as styles and
No headings.
Whoops. See? No headings. Let me just transfer
Task
to the
switching,
accessible
even old
version.
typist handout 1.
And you have the
Style
styles
name,
pane.
edit.
This is your
Modify, button.
This
Styles
is
button.
your toolbox. Everything in here. Heading styles, list styles, table styles. So what you want is a flexible document, one that can be changed to suit the user, either by you if you want to convert it to PDF, or by the user if they have a style set that they want to use. So this has just given you a little toe in to how accessible document design works. It's all about flexibility, it's all about structure, and it's all about learning and not being in transit as I was. Of course, you've got more of an excuse than I had because you're fighting 5,000 years of habit, which I didn't have. But I hope this has just given you a little introduction of what you might learn. There is a handout on the meetup page with my contact on it and a very good website from a woman called Karen McCall from Carlin Communications, and she has a lot of teaching resources. But if you want live ones, give me a yell. I'll be very happy to help so that one day everyone who writes will do it inclusively.
Even old type, meeting controls. Meeting controls.
Thank you so much for that, Kylie. That was a fantastic demonstration of a screen reader. I'm sure that's new for a lot of our attendees. So we're going to open up the Q&A for the attendees. So we'll just wait and see if any questions come through. But in the meantime, we have a question for you from our meetup. Would you say that your experience in accessing web content has changed for the better over the years or for the worse?
It hasn't really changed much at all, I'm afraid. It's about the same as it was. Technology has tried to keep up, but it's never going to. The only thing that's going to keep up is if we have the design correct. And in document accessibility, it's even worse. It's so much less known than web design is even, which is why I've chosen it. Lots of people are doing accessible web design, but hardly anyone's doing documents. And I think it's just as important because everything needs a structure, everything needs the right elements in the right place, whether it's an accessibility reason or not.
Thank you. Yes, so true. Lauren, do we have any questions from the Q&A panel?
Nothing's come through in the Q&A panel, but there was a comment in the chat just saying telling us a bit more about how we can use screen readers as a tool to teach designers and developers, but also in this case, how can they use it to kind of show everyone what are your kind of recommendations to people in organizations doing demos and using that as a tool to show people how to kind of structure their documents?
Well, as I say, I've only just given you a tiny toe in the water. I'd suggest you go to the Carlin Communications website and get some of Karen's resources. She's taught me most of what I know. She's been doing this for many years. She's vision impaired. She's got a lot of good online self-paced individual teaching tools. So if you want to know initially, but I think you really need to have hands-on with this in a workshop style. And if you do want that, then do give me a yell. It's something you can try playing around with it, but use the right tool for the right job. Don't be tempted to use a table style for a heading, for instance, just because it looks good. And don't choose a heading 4 where you need a heading 3 because you like the style better. Make yourself up a template. The right tool for the right job, as Montgomery Scott of Star Trek says.
Thank you very much for that, Kylie. So with that, we want to say a huge thank you for the time and effort you put into that presentation. And we're going to go on to our next speaker, which is Maz Hermon. Maz is a UX UI developer at TradeMe, and his topic is top 5 ALI mistakes or accessibility mistakes I used to make. Over to you, Maz.
Thanks, Zoe. Cool. Yeah, I've been at TradeMe for the last 5 years, and I've just moved over to Xero now. So it's been a fun journey with TradeMe, and we've hopefully started moving towards a good direction. So everyone can. Yeah, we'll see how that goes over time. So I'll just share my screen. What have we got here? If you just want to let me know when that is working as expected.
Sure.
I'll just start a timer.
Always
cool. So yeah, top 5 ALI mistakes, digital accessibility mistakes I used to make when I was just getting started. On the first slide, there's just a picture of some computers with some sort of wireframe UI user interface things going on.
We're not seeing the screen there, Maz, sorry.
Oh, you're not seeing the screen?
No.
I'll try that again. Hold on. How's that?
Yeah, great.
We good? Awesome. Sorry about that. Cool. So yeah, the top 5 mistakes I used to make that I look back on now as mistakes. So what this isn't is a talk about the 5 mistakes I'm currently making, or my top 5 mistakes I make at the moment. So either you can teach me about those, or I'll learn those over time, and maybe I can do another talk about that, because I'm well aware that I'll be making them. Cool. So I'm just going to rip through it. So I'm onto the first slide here. Number 1, being too helpful. So this is something I used to do a lot, and I think it's easy when you first learn a few tricks. You're first getting into this stuff, and you're like, oh, I can make some text that no one can see, but it's still available to screen readers or something like that. You can get a bit overzealous and kind of start, whoa, I'll just make it so amazing that it'll be the best thing ever. And you can kind of lead yourself down the garden path and end up being too helpful in a way that you're just creating a lot of noise for people. So screen readers is the example that comes to mind for me there. I thought it'd be funny to talk about an analogy when you could make someone a cup of tea, but you don't necessarily need to tell them how to drink that tea. If you made it, you might ask them if they want milk. Sure, that's helpful, but you don't need to say, here's your tea. If you would like a sip, lift it to your mouth and just tip it slightly and it'll pour into your mouth. So just to give that some context, maybe you're working on a form, accessible form, and you've just learned about how to use radio controls with the keyboard. And because it's new to you, you think, oh, maybe we should put some screen reader text in here that says, oh, you can use your up and down arrows to select the options. But you're just telling people things that they already know and that they've been dealing with for years. So yeah, just be aware that don't be too helpful, even if it's good intentions can kind of make things tricky. I've got avoiding duplicates there, but I've got another slide coming up that's gonna illustrate that a little bit. So I'll leave that till then. Yeah, I sort of mentioned telling people things that they already know. Just be aware that some people have been using these things for years or been working around issues for years. They're not always going to need you to let them know that they can click a button or something like that. Button, click here to do this thing, or if you click this, press enter to click the button. That's all things that they've learned. People know. Labeling all the things. I've got under being too helpful, because once you learn how to some labeling techniques, maybe you're using ARIA label, or maybe you're sort of visually hiding some text inside a button or a link or something like that. You can think, oh, well, I'll just label everything. Like someone with one of those label guns that walks around the house looking for things to label. Yeah, just be aware of that. So I guess my point there is just ask yourself the question, like, how do I know that this is actually a good idea? And if you can't back that up, if it just seems like you're doing it because you want to go above and beyond, then maybe you don't need to do that. Yeah, and I've just put the point here that you can end up accidentally creating a completely different experience. And one thing I always sort of clung on to, and I still think is valid, is you're trying to give the same experience to everyone, or at least give everyone access to the same information. Give people this whole other experience just because they're on a screen reader or something like that. I'm going to call out my over-focus on screen readers as well as one of my points. But just moving on to slide 2. So now I'm just showing an illustration of what I mentioned before, which is duplicate labels, things like that. So I've got here just a mock-up of a button that I just put in the slides, and it's a like button. So there's a border of the button, and there's a little heart, and next to the heart it says like. And so in the past, when I was first getting started, I might have thought, hey, I've got an SVG here. I know how to give an SVG an accessible name. I'll give that SVG a title tag inside the SVG. And so let's say you did that and you gave it the title of like, because that's what the context of your heart was at the time. But then also buttons get their accessible name from their content, things that are inside. So you've got the heart there, and you've also got the word like. And so by the time you've got both those things, if you did be too helpful in this case, label the SVG when the text was already there right next to it, you can end up having a button that's called like instead of just like. And as you sort of first use the screen reader, sometimes you might think, oh, I didn't realize that. This is unexpectedly awful. But little things like that can trip you up. So in that scenario, I would either not label that. I could be wrong with this, but I would not label that SVG with the title, and I may even put aria hidden equals true on that, because I'm leaving the words like to label that button. If I really wanted to go overboard, and this is where I'd probably end up being too helpful again, I might hide some visually hidden text in a span or something that says like this particular post or whatever the context is. But that's just a vague, that's not necessarily a good example, but just to illustrate the point of duplicating names by accident. Cool, so next slide, number 2. Just because you can aria doesn't mean you should. I think it's exciting when you first get to know aria and you realize, and you sort of read the spec and you're like, oh, okay, they've got all these patterns for how I should be doing everything. And you don't realize that, oh, okay, that's sort of like almost like a future kind of thing that, yeah, there's a lot of people on older technology, because if they update, they'll have to learn all their workarounds again, or that's not always going to be the case, but that you have to sort of keep in mind that some people might be on some older versions of things than you might naturally be supporting. And even things like versions of screen readers, some of these more proprietary ones have been expensive in the past, and they might not want to be upgrading. And so even something as simple as aria label might not work as consistently across everyone's software as you might imagine. So the golden rule with this stuff, as far as I've heard, is just stick to your HTML, do everything, your semantic HTML. Don't lean on aria unless you're just doing some extensions on top of what HTML couldn't provide. But when you do reach for it, so I was in that position, I was already focusing on HTML and not implementing aria things when I didn't need to, but then I would reach for aria label. And I ended up, after a colleague of mine, Kat, showed me a table of, actually someone's done this comparison of all these browser screen reader combinations. aria label works in all these different ways across all of those things. And I was actually opened my eyes and I thought, okay, maybe we should start using visually hidden text inside these things where we would otherwise reach for aria label. So yeah, aria is still cool, but it's just not as useful as you think it will be when you first start learning about it. I think it's good to keep in mind. Yeah, so number 3, I've lost my timer, by the way. I didn't start properly, so I'm just going to keep it short, but give me a warning, Zoe.
You're good. You're all good, Maz.
Cool. Yeah, number 3, waiting to be ready to do usability testing for accessibility. There was a point in my time at TradeMe where we were building out a big design system that the rest of the company was going to use to help build the new TradeMe, which you'll see on phones these days and some desktops. But yeah, at the time I remember thinking, hey, we're not ready for this. When we started talking, should we do some usability testing for accessibility more towards the beginning? It's like, oh no, there's already so many things that we know we haven't done yet, that it would be rude almost to go and ask people how this thing is when there's already millions of things we know we can do. So we should do those things and then go and ask. Whereas that was a mistake I've found later on, because one, it takes a long time actually to organize that project and get the funding for it and put everything together, get all your ducks in a row where you could actually kick off that usability testing. We actually had some lined up just before COVID hit, and it was really exciting. And then, yeah, that didn't work out. Hopefully that's just about to kick off now. But yeah, don't wait to be ready, because early on you'll still be getting a lot of great information, and you might just learn that things that you thought you knew were actually wrong anyway. So if you can do usability testing for accessibility, just start organizing it almost from day one. Number 4, over prioritizing screen reader support. This is, everyone might have different opinions on this, but for me, I found in my journey, I started my journey by getting into screen reader support, and I was like, oh, okay, this is super interesting. And that sort of brought me into accessibility in general. But I noticed that with a lot of other people as well. And I found like our time in the teams I was supporting, people almost started to think that accessibility and screen reader support were the same thing, digital accessibility, and that as long as they ticked off the screen reader support, then they could sort of check the box. And then we weren't focusing so much on cognitive issues, cognitive barriers that we were putting in front of people, which a lot of people could benefit from. And I think it's super interesting or keyboard support even, a lot of the time, even though that should be a given, yeah, wasn't always, sometimes put as a follow-up case that it's hard to prioritize sometimes. So sometimes it's done and it's awesome. But yeah, it can be easy to over prioritize one thing, whatever it is for you. For me, it was screen reader support, which I still think is like an essential part of making your products accessible. It's just not the be all and end all in itself. And you might look at your users, if you can get this information, can be tricky, but yeah. And it's not only people who are blind or have low vision that use screen readers. All sorts of people use screen readers for different reasons. So it is a wider group than just blind and low vision. But it's interesting to think how many people might have cognitive issues or benefit from the thinking we could put into making things easy to use from a cognitive load perspective. So just be aware of that. If you see that happening as you progress with your company, then challenge that a little bit if you can. This is a massive one for me. This is kind of my last one, because the last one will take no time at all. But there was a long time where I said, this might seem really ridiculous to a lot of people, but we was doing our work and we were prioritizing what accessibility things that we were going to be focusing on as we built this design system out. And I remember thinking a lot, like, oh, okay, I think people who are deaf and hard of hearing will kind of be fine, because we're not doing anything audio visual anyway. And there was this big aha moment. I can't even remember where I heard about it, but I think some people came in and spoke to us. Some people who were deaf came in and spoke to us and explained that actually, if you grow up with NZSL as your first language, or Auslan, or depending on where you are, if sign is your first language, you might actually, your English literacy in terms of reading and writing might be really far behind what someone like me would expect and had expected. I was thinking, oh, people who are deaf and hard of hearing would just use the web the same way as me, as long as it's not like videos involved and audio things involved. And that was so wrong that now I look back at it and think, wow, I was so naive on that one. So I thought that was a good one to point out. And the last one, asking for permission. Maybe just don't. If you're in a situation where you're doing some work and you feel like you could make it more accessible, and that's part of doing your job properly, maybe you don't need to ask so much for permission. That's up to you and to figure that one out. But there's a certain amount of confidence that can give you to be like, actually, this is just part of doing my job. I'm just going to do it. Yeah, so that's me. So that's from a front-end developer's perspective, who's 5 years into caring about accessibility and being aware of it. In terms of digital accessibility, that's kind of my 5 things I look back on and think, those are all things I thought I knew that now I realize were a bit wrong. And like I said in the beginning, I'm very well aware that there'll be a lot of things I'll look back on from what I do now, what I think I know now, that will turn out to be, yeah, fodder for another presentation. Thanks a lot for your time, and thanks for giving me the chance to speak. So,
thank you so much, Maz. We really enjoyed that presentation. Some great tips. It's always great learning from other people's mistakes. Unfortunately, not for the person, but yeah, we can learn a lot. Thank you very much, Maz. So we're going to open up the Q&A now. And if any of the panelists also have questions, please feel free post them or to just directly ask Maz. Lauren, do we have any in the?
Yes, we do. We have a question from Tonya. So how does everyone get the same access when their access needs can vary so greatly?
Yeah, I guess that's a great question. I feel unqualified to answer that. But yeah, I guess what springs to mind is that people working on products which can be more accessible, it's kind of up to us all and people to advocate these things to make sure that we are considering the broad range of needs that we all have. So it's just about educating ourselves, coming to things like this. Yeah, I like I say, I feel really unqualified to speak so generally on the topic, but yeah, hopefully that's somewhat is some sort of answer.
I see Kylie's raised your hand. Did you want to comment on that as well, Kylee?
Yes, Maz, I have a question. Why do so many front-end developers not do what you do? Is it just they don't know, or is it because they are under pressure with deadlines and things and they want to take shortcuts? Why is it, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's both of those things. But one big reason that I've spoken about in the past is just that we need to talk about it more, and it needs to be something that's pulled up on code reviews, because as front-end developers, like, opinions are flying everywhere all the time, and everyone's always like talking about the best way to do everything. If none of those conversations involve accessibility and the things that we're doing to ensure that everyone can use our products, then that becomes not important, because someone just told you 10 things you had to fix with your code that you could learn from, and it could be better because of these things. If some of those things aren't within the kind of realm of accessibility, then you send people the message that it's not important. So I think the more that people talk about it and the more that people pull it up, even if you know that, let's say you know you're doing a code review and you know that someone's not going to have the time to do, not going to be given the time by their team or whatever the situation is to do keyboard functionality on something, you still call it out anyway, and you just say that's something that needs to be done. Make sure that you do that before it goes out. And even if you know they're not going to be able to take that on, at least like you've put the pressure on. So yeah, I think making sure we all talk about it is probably number one, because that makes it important and relevant.
Thank you.
Awesome, thanks, Maz. We have another question if we still have time. So from a question from Dan saying, did you approach disability organisations directly to organise testers, or use a third party or go between such as DIA?
Yeah, cool. Yeah, so when I was at TradeMe, which I've moved on from now, the first thing that happened is the UX team put out an invite through friends and family and associates of the people that worked there, which is quite a big company, so there was a few of us. So we sort of just branched out that way and then got people in just for interviews, just for chats, not to do usability testing on particular flows or the product or anything. And that was kind of step one, and that was super interesting. And I think we could have done more to kind of spread that throughout the company, but it was our first sort of step at getting to know real people and getting some real information coming in. From then on, it moved to approaching people like Utopia, and we ended up progressing with Blind and Low Vision New Zealand had something called Access Advisors, and we had a relationship with them from the past as well. And so we were working with them to source some people that they had access to do usability testing remotely, and we were going to be visiting in homes. This is all sort of pre-COVID world, and yeah, so I think hopefully that's about to kick off. But yeah, combination of going through our own networks and then reaching out to third parties who focus on these things. I think that's a really good thing to do, because you need that variety. And if you're in a bigger company that's got the budget and you can do it faster, that's probably the way that I would recommend go. Because there's a lot to it, and there's a lot of expertise involved in running those UX sessions that goes beyond the skill set of UX people in general. Like if they haven't had a focus on this stuff, running those sessions. So won't be true for everyone, but for a lot of people, yeah, having that additional support from a third party that specializes is going to be a good idea. Hopefully that answers the question. I know I can go off topic and answers.
Yes. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next speaker. Thank you very much for your great presentation, Maz. Our next speaker is Carl. So Carl Noon is a coach and scrum master at ASB, and his topic is why yes, I also need a screen reader. Over to you, Carl.
Cool, thanks Zoe. Good evening everyone. It's great to be with all of you tonight. Thanks for having me. I'm just gonna set the screen share up really quickly. Now I'm hoping this comes up. All right, you guys can all see this.
Yes.
Those of you who, yep, brilliant. So, as Zoe mentioned, so my topic today is called why yes, I also need a screen reader. Yep. So I'm currently working as an agile coach at ASB. However, my previous life I was a tester and a BA. And a lot of my testing experience will come into what I'm sharing with you today. What I'll cover overall is the reason why I need a screen reader, what made me start using it in the first place, and really just touch briefly on my time as a tester and how these things that happen in life influenced a lot of the testing and how I approached accessibility. And I'll wrap up really quickly with a couple of personal reflections of my own. So at age 25, I'd been wearing glasses since I was about 14 at this stage. And I just noticed that year on year on, my vision was getting worse and worse. And at age 25, I was diagnosed with an eye condition called keratoconus. Now, if you think about the eye, the cornea is that bit on the top which we see through, and it's typically shaped like a dome. For those of us who have keratoconus, the cornea can no longer hold its shape, and it becomes more and more cone-shaped. The surface of the cornea is irregular, and as such, our vision begins to go. Now, you guys may not see it, but I'm wearing a very solid pair of contact lenses right now, which correct the shape of the cornea and help me see. So that's why I'm not having to wear glasses. It looks a little something like this. For those of you who are unable to see the screen share, if you look at the, if you would imagine the eye looking a bit more like a mountain than a dome, the scleral lens that I'm wearing sits over the top so the light can come in straight, because otherwise it looks a little bit like this. When I see what most of you would see is this image on the left, which is just a normal dot. Without the lenses, I see about 20 dots. That's why whenever somebody says to me, hey, the moon looks awesome, I'm first to say, which one? Because I see about 20. And corrected, I still see, while I have a bit more focus, I still see quite a bit of double vision. And really it may cause, so having keratoconus causes double vision, shadows around objects, and what it does look like. So I'm just showing you a few images before I get to the next, before I get to the meat of what we'll be covering. Again, here's another one that you can see. So at the bottom is what you would see as a busy street, whereas the top is what I see when I'm wearing my contact lenses. And one last one, this is how some of you will look to me if you ever see me squinting. Lots of, it's about as close as an approximation as I can get. So a couple of years ago, because of all this, a couple of years ago, I realized that things were becoming very, very difficult in terms of just being able to read things, even with the lenses on. If I go back to here, if you imagine with this rightmost image, a block of text, but all the letters looking like this and letters beginning to overlap, sometimes it becomes very tricky to read things. So I began relying on the screen reader on my iPhone. not necessarily for the gestures and trying to find my way around, but sometimes it was just so I could look at a menu on for a restaurant, or if I was flying late and I wasn't able to wear my lenses on a long haul flight because they dry out, I'd need to use a screen reader. And it was there were moments throughout my own kind of experience over the last couple of years where, admittedly, and this kind of goes back to some of the stuff that's been talked about in the previous sessions, where I'd personally find myself getting frustrated because I couldn't get to the text that I wanted to read. Or I would later find out that they'd put a whole bunch of text in, but it was actually an SVG image and I couldn't read anything. And so I would have these moments where it was very frustrating. And what that began to do was really began to influence my my time testing. So Zoe mentioned that I'm working at ASB. A little side story, very relevant. Zoe actually came in at one point to help train a lot of the people at ASB on accessibility. And so I'm never going to forget that. Zoe, you are awesome. That's always going to be one of the best moments of having worked in the testing team at ASB, because it was so cool that accessibility was finally getting a lot of attention. And I'm very happy to say that there's a very cool, big accessibility community at ASB until now, and we're constantly talking and constantly trading ideas and constantly trying to find better ways to do things. But the thing that I wanted to share with you guys today, in addition to me having to use a screen reader, was my I'd like to call it the aha moment. So I'd like you to imagine me sitting there at the ASB trying to use a screen reader as a testing tool, and realizing, hang on, there's definitely a more interesting way to do this. And so the poor my poor workmate sitting next to me had the fortune or misfortune to watch me just pull both of these contact lenses out of my eyes, put them into a little case on my desk, put the headphones in, and be sitting this close to the screen because I couldn't see anything, and using the screen reader that way. And what that did for me in terms of a light bulb moment was it stopped me from thinking about, well, which WCAG standard are we not adhering to, or which requirement is this? All of a sudden, all I was thinking of was, can I actually do what I'm trying to do? As a if as a company putting something out to a customer, if we're saying that we're making this accessible, is it actually possible to achieve the things that we're actually telling customers we're allowing them to achieve? And what that did was it actually made me find some very interesting bugs. One of them, which I mentioned, was the fact that, text on images and not being able to have them read out. But what it also did, because I was now speaking from a place of personal experience as opposed to theoretical, but what about the person who's blind? It was me speaking from, well, I actually have trouble seeing it normally. This is why it's an issue. It made things a lot easier for me to articulate, made things a lot easier for me to say, well, no, this is something that definitely needs to be dealt with, because if I can't deal with it with my low vision, then somebody who has less vision than me will definitely struggle. And those were the very cool moments. And admittedly, as I mentioned, since I'm not working in testing anymore, admittedly, those are some of the moments that I do personally miss, being able to work and help people in that way. Yeah, this is the overall not much more else to cover. I think the last bit I want to really touch on, guys, is just a few personal reflections that I've realized over the years. So the first thing that was really amazing for me, and it's been touched on, is that not everybody who uses a screen reader is blind. Because when I started using one, I didn't realize how helpful it could be just to be able to read big blocks of text and not struggle was life-changing. It's definitely helped me out day to day. The other thing that really stuck out with me over the years testing was one of the best measures was not whether you've met every single standard, but can your users actually do what they need to do on your site? And one personal note for me is, you know, I know that as I get older, I'm not going to have the same dexterity to be able to put these lenses into my eyes. But it's a very cool thought knowing that there's a community out there like you guys who really care about digital accessibility. So I know I've got a future to look forward to where the web is an accessible place, and that is awesome. So thank you guys for having me, and open to questions, but otherwise have an awesome evening.
Thank you so much, Carl. That was a very inspiring talk, and on a personal level, it kind of has more of an impact. So thank you very much for your time and effort. So Lauren, do we have any questions from the Q&A panel?
Nothing has come through yet, so if anyone wants to pop in a question, it's just down in the bottom panel. But yeah, otherwise there's been few comments on the chat, one from Sarah about saying usable, accessible over WCAG. And then, yeah, Gareth kind of commented back saying you can be 100% WCAG AAA and still to be totally unusable. So
correct, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
I have a question for you, Carl.
Sure.
How easy was it for you to have to learn how to use a screen reader?
Not very easy, and at the beginning, because one of those things, if I'm being really honest, one of the things that prevented me from doing it sooner was there's a large sense of pride that you don't want to admit that you're losing your eyesight slowly, or that your eyesight is getting worse. So I put it off for a long time, and of course, when I started, it was very much me with either glasses or contact lenses on and saying, well, it's fine, I can still see it. But then I really, it was that same thing, that very light bulb moment, which made me realize, well, I'm not always going to have these. What happens if I can't? I'm going to have to learn how to do this eventually, so I might as well start learning now. And I believe it's like any skill. You just need to put the time in. There's a lot of stuff that happens like behind the scenes that that screen readers do, and the one reason I like using my phone at the moment is because it's all gesture based, and so it wasn't very difficult to pick that up once I decided to put the time in.
Thank you. Sorry, my mother's just calling me on my phone. Hope you didn't hear that. Thank you very much. Very insightful response. I think, do we have any Q&A, any questions in the Q&A now, Lauren?
No, not yet, but yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Any of our panelists have a question for Carl? Well, that must mean that you did an awesome job of explaining everything. Thank you so much for your time, Carl, and a great presentation.
Thanks, Zoe. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, so now we're on to our last but definitely not least speaker. And this is Tamsin Ewing. She's a content designer and web accessibility advisor at the DIA. And her topic is finding the needle in the haystack, helping web accessibility practitioners understand and deliver on accessibility. We look forward to hearing your presentation.
Kia ora koutou, everyone. It's lovely to be here with you today. I'm just sorting out my screen here, just making sure that it's There we go. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, so thank you for giving the title of the topic. And yep, I'm a content designer at DIA. And my topic basically is a project to help practitioners and organizations in New Zealand understand and deliver on accessibility. And there's certainly some similar thinking to some of the work that Gareth was describing. The aim is to make it easier to understand the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG 2.1, by organizing them around practitioner roles and the work that they specifically do. And the goal is, for the most part, to direct people to existing quality guidance that's already out there. Because there's already so much guidance. You know, as Gareth was pointing out, you know, with WCAG, it's a technical document. It's brilliant as a reference document, but it's not easy reading material. Recently, we surveyed some practitioners to ask them to describe their experience of using WCAG guidelines, and these are some of the things they said. Confusing and overwhelming, complex and hard to find, weird language, hard to digest, and it's a search by numbers. You know, it's a lot, right? And most of the guidance that we have access to here in New Zealand has been developed overseas. So it's hard to know what's good and what isn't. And does it actually cover what we need in New Zealand? Because New Zealand requirements can differ from other countries. And here, if we are to meet the New Zealand Government Web Accessibility Standard, we need to meet WCAG 2.1. And so the problem that we face in New Zealand is that it's been 17 years since we've been mandated to make our websites accessible. But as Kylee was saying, you know, there's not much progress. Our websites, and that includes government and public sector websites, continue to have basic and critical accessibility issues and exclude people with disabilities from being able to access online information and services. Accessibility just isn't baked into the development cycle from the beginning, and it's still considered a special skill that only some digital practitioners have, when really it's the responsibility of the whole team. So to address the issues that practitioners are experiencing, we need guidance that acts as a central resource coming from government, because it's mandated by government. So the plan for this project is to put together a suite of guidelines that are organized around roles and the work that they do. And I'm not sure, you know, when you say document driven, I'm not sure, it sounds like it's the same thing, but I've got another label for it. We've been working hard on that label, so it'd be interesting to hear what you have to say, Gareth. But it's you know, guidelines that are organized around roles, the work that they do, which will point to discrete WCAG techniques. So I'm working closely with Jason Kiss, DIA's Principal Advisor on Accessibility, and he's keeping me real. We're using a design process, and these 3 questions are helping us to explore the problem and to inform the direction of the guidance. So how might we help practitioners to quickly understand what's required to make work, their web work, conform to the New Zealand Government Web Accessibility Standard? How might we help them easily incorporate critical accessibility techniques into their everyday tasks? And how might we help them clearly identify the best practice guidance that's already out there? We're still in the discovery phase, and currently reaching out to the community of practitioners to test our findings from the research. And I can give you an email address if you're interested to participate. Where the roles are concerned, there are a lot of different job titles out there, but we've refined them down to the following 8 core practitioner roles so far. So these 5 roles have a huge influence on whether the accessibility work gets done. The business stakeholder senior manager, the product owner project manager, user researcher, information architect, and the QA tester or analyst. And these 3 roles are the ones that actually apply the necessary techniques to make the web content they design or build accessible. The user interface visual designer, the developer, and the content designer. So everyone plays a part. Looking at the guidance through the lens of roles isn't an entirely new approach around the world. Others have taken it, but in New Zealand, it doesn't exist. And as I've said before, it's not about reinventing the wheel and adding more guidelines to the pool unless we identify a gap. It will be linking to the best practice guidance out there that meets New Zealand requirements. So far, we've identified about 40 of the most common, what we're calling web content types. That's sort of the document driven, I'm not sure, but web content types is what we're calling them. For example, an accordion or button or you know, videos perhaps for a content designer. These common web content types that roles will be able to filter by according to their responsibilities, and all of them linked to WCAG success criteria. These will also be provided as an A to Z list, which we're aiming to make quite comprehensive, and so hopefully it's useful. And the plan is to write all the guidance you need around each of these web content types. So let's say a content designer is creating a glossary on a web page, or a developer is creating a side navigation menu. So we want to make sure that, that you know, the best practice guidance on how to make it accessible is linked to right here. There are some examples of what good looks like. Who would benefit from this, you know, what types of disabilities would not be able to access it if you didn't do this work, how to test that you've done it right, and what WCAG success criteria, of course, this work meets. That's kind of important to know. So, just getting there. In summary, the new guidance will be able to be filtered through 3 different lenses: by role, through the lens of the individual practitioners; by topics, through the lens of general knowledge areas about accessibility that are relevant to different roles; and through the lens of web content types, the A to Z list. So now I'm a visual designer, so I've developed a tool using Kumu to map the relationships between all the data so we can see the patterns and connections between elements. People learn in different ways, and I'm hoping it will be a helpful tool in testing the robustness of the guidance, as well as ultimately making it available so people can have a play and filter according to their different perspectives. It can also be downloaded as a spreadsheet and provided in an accessible tabular format, which makes it accessible to everyone. So you can see the roles in the center of the map. I'm sorry, you know, it's all small, so I'm just going to describe like the concepts really of the map, and then in a moment I'll give you a little demo. The roles are in the center of the map in yellow, and then there's a circle around them of the topics or the knowledge areas in green. And then in blue are the 40 web content types, so 40 plus. You know, we're still establishing, you know, what everybody needs. And finally, in red are the 50 WCAG 2.1 success criteria that apply to the web content types. The ones in the big circle are the AA criteria that must be met if a website is to conform to New Zealand's government web accessibility standard. But off to the right are the additional 28 AAA success criteria if people want to go for this level. It's the highest level, but not necessarily the hardest to implement. It's just sometimes the hardest to test for. So the map is still in development, and a lot of relationships haven't been mapped out, but I'll just show you how it would work if you're interested. Okay, so it's a relationship map showing how roles are connected to the work that they do. And you can see them how, when it zooms back out again, how it relates to the 40 plus web content types. And then you can hover over one of the roles. For example, this is the content designer, and you can see some of the web content types a content designer works with. And then you can see which AA success criteria apply to a web content type. So here we're highlighting a video, and you can see the AA success criteria. But if you wanted to see the AAA, then you can see that as well for the video. You can see all these additional things that you could do if you wanted to go the extra mile. And then there are the topics. So these are the knowledge areas that apply to different roles. For example, a manager might need to know about what is web accessibility, why accessibility matters, or embedding accessibility in your organization. While a developer needs to know pretty much everything and has additional topics like best practices for accessible content and beyond WCAG. The tool also allows you to filter by one or more elements in each category. So I'll just show you here are a list of the topics that we've got at the moment. These are the broad headings underneath our all different child pages, if you like, of these topics. And you can also choose a particular success criterion, for example, 142, audio control, and see which web content type it applies to. And in the side panel, you can see some information with a link to the WCAG requirements, or you can click on the web content type and find out what are the accessibility techniques I really need to know about. So it's just a sort of a way of mapping the guidance so that we can eventually turn it all into web pages. So that is the project. The guidance is likely to start being published on digital.gov.nz in September, and we're trying to make sure that that site actually meets the standard by then, because we still have some work to do. So we hope this new guidance will make it easier for practitioners to incorporate accessibility work into their everyday tasks, that expertise will grow in New Zealand, and that we see a growth in the number of websites that meet the New Zealand government web accessibility standards, so that no one is excluded from accessing online information and services. And as a parting comment, based on my experience, if you want to understand WCAG 2.1, map out all the guidance. It's a slog, but you learn so much. Thank you very much. And if you'd like to be involved or ever have any questions, please do get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamsin. Great presentation, addressing, well, what you're doing, the work that you're trying to do to address those needs within government and public sector sites to adhere to WCAG. Thank you so much. So I've noticed there's a few questions already, Lauren.
Yes, there is a few questions. Just want to start with saying just how impressed I am with the mapping you've done, and it's absolutely amazing. I was wondering, how long have you been working on that?
Well, the map has been, I built it right at the start of the project. So I started doing the research a few months ago. That's just like basically an environmental scan of what guidance exists in the world, what are people looking for, or what seemed to be the most useful. I'm looking at it very, very much from a practitioner perspective, because I've been very passionate about accessibility for a good 10 years, but have had tremendous frustrations and suffering from lack of time, basically, to get my head into it. Every time I do something, I find myself dealing with numbers and which success criteria actually apply to the thing I'm doing right now. I just want an easy way in. So I started like that, and then have been talking a lot with other practitioners. So it's just this need for something a bit more comprehensive than already exists perhaps out there. Certainly doesn't exist in New Zealand, and people are stumbling around in the dark, not really sure what to trust.
Thank you, that's great. And we have a question from Steve, who's asking about the web accessibility clinics. Are they likely to restart soon? And do you know of any other things that are like this in the works, because they are great and very useful?
So yes, actually, that's very timely. I had a meeting last Friday with Jason, and we would like to start the clinics in August. So I think it's the last Thursday of August would be when we are going to restart them, and there should be some information coming out 2 weeks before that, so very soon. Sorry, was there another question? The web clinics, and what was the other question?
If there was anything else in the works coming up that is similar to that.
Well, to the tool itself, no, but there are other initiatives in government that are happening right now. So there is the New Zealand Design System, which is still in alpha, and that is going to make it easy to stand up an accessible website. There's also new legislation being led by the Ministry of Social Development on behalf of the Minister for Disabilities. So that's going to make it, I don't know, tougher if people don't meet. I'm not quite sure, don't have any information, but I just know this new legislation, they're trying to bring a bit more stick and less carrot or something into making this happen. And the other initiative is that there's some discovery work being done, again led by DIA, to interview practitioners in New Zealand, and also mid and high-level executive management about this, the systemic barriers that people are encountering. I think they're also going to talk to vendors and other companies, just basically what are the barriers, and so that we don't just keep making the same mistakes. Yeah, it's just not working, whatever we're doing right now. So we want to make it easier for people to, just learn it, incorporate it as part of their, a bit like the work that Gareth was talking about. You can have people who are passionate and they will be the experts, but as soon as they leave, the organization, is in the dark again. So you just want it to be incorporated. Like architects, they used to design buildings and then run off and talk to an accessibility specialist about widening the doors and putting ramps in. But nowadays it's part of the skill of being an architect. You do actually, you just know you've got to do the accessible side of it as well. So digital accessibility probably it might be more complex, I don't know, because it's a fast moving industry, but certainly it's something that all of us can we're responsible for, and we can improve, each one of us. It's just making it easy to understand how.
Thank you, that's great. We have one last question, which is, what moves is DIA or other agencies making to recruit people with lived experience of accessibility or disability to roles and development in service design teams?
Well, that is such an excellent question, because I ask the same question myself all the time. It's very important. And I think, again, going back to what Gareth was saying, there's something about none of this work works unless it's in the culture, unless management are supporting the initiatives, unless we, HR understands, like our hiring and our inductions and even our training modules, our intranets, all of these things. If we were hiring people with lived experience, then and testing, even if it's just doing user research, then people would just become much more aware and make sure that the equipment around us works for everyone and not just for able-bodied people, and also, it's sometimes a situational, temporary thing, so it can happen to anybody at any time.
Thank you very much.
So sorry, I don't have an answer to that. I'm asking that question myself, pushing for it, if you like.
Okay, so is that the last of the questions, or is there one more in there, Lauren?
That was the last one there, yep.
Okay.
Answered.
I didn't really answer the question about the Kumu tool properly, I just realized. And what I'm trying to say is that it's been part of the project all along. And so the more information I have about how, things are connected to each other, the more the map will become robust. And I'm hoping to be able to share that, with people. So it's progressing with the project. It's not finished until the project's done, probably.
Thank you so much, Tamsin, for the time and effort you put in into your presentation and sharing with us what's happening in local government. Thank you so much. Thank you to all our speakers. Unfortunately, one of our speakers couldn't make it, so we do have a few extra minutes. What I would like to suggest, if the panelists are open, is for the Q&A to go open to the whole panel. So are you all keen? Thumbs up if you're keen.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so we'll open the Q&A for everybody.
May I just probably say first, Tamsin, congratulations and thank you for making an accessible version of your guide, because so often it is assumed that disabled people are only the beneficiaries of this and not contributors to it.
Well, thank you. Absolutely. Yes. Very important.
Doesn't look like any questions are coming in.
Wall of
It's
silence.
bamboozled them all.
Just wanted to note that there were some questions that weren't answered, we weren't able to answer at the time, but the speakers have actually gone and written some text-based answers to those questions in the chat, which we can share later as well. I think that can be an excerpt if we need to.
Yep.
I've got a general comment I can add if it's useful.
Yes.
Cool. Just one reflection on working inside an organization where you've got a bunch of people sort of striving for change and like trying to make things better. One thing would help people like me in that situation out a lot is we actually monitor, like we have feedback channel open for the new responsive trade me that we're building, and it probably still is open. And we're monitoring that feedback all the time, and things that come in, if people actually are complaining about things, even though it's not everyone's job to complain about things for them to be better, we should be doing it anyway. But it gives you power within a team to say, hey, people are talking about this being a problem for them. They're real. It makes you a real person when if you're complaining. It's actually like, I know people have fatigue about complaining. I'm not saying that it's everyone's responsibility to complain. But if you do that, and if people could channel their like focus, like if you've got a group of people that are all know something could be better, if you all complain at the same site at the same time for a little while, it's actually super, like you're actually hooking someone up that's working in there trying to make change. You're actually giving them like a ticket to be able to prioritize that work. Even if they know about it, they might be in there saying, hey, we need to do this. And someone else might be saying, yeah, but how many people is that really going to affect? No one's even talking about it in the feedback. So just a shout out to like, your voices are heard inside companies, even in the private sector. And like, yeah, not to forget that
big organisation. The BBC isn't huge. I mean, we've got about 18,000 members of staff. I mean, in some ways that's large, but when we look at other broadcasters, we're quite small. And organisations who do VOD, etc. But we encourage everyone give us feedback and give us as much information as you can. We read everything. I mean, we get 5,000 to 10,000 correspondence a day from our audience, but that information is so useful. And contextualize it. Tell us about the equipment you're using. Tell us when it happened. Tell us what you experienced. And it's really, really useful because then we can try and recreate the problem. And then we can then start investigating and then getting stuck into stuff. But exactly what Maz said, it's not really complaints, it's user feedback, it's dialogue. And without that dialogue, we're constantly seeking that dialogue, but come to us and it all does come through. You'll get a standard response and then it ends up with the product team. And then we have a discussion and then we try and investigate it a little bit further and go, is there something we're missing here? Is there an opportunity here? How big is this? And then we'll go off and talk to a representative organization and say, have you ever heard about this before? And it expands. And sometimes we've ended up going to talk to Apple or Microsoft or Google because it's actually a shared problem between us and them. And then it creates a bigger thing. You've no idea how useful feedback is. It's brilliant.
Thank you. That's really powerful.
I think speaking for the community, though, we do get complaint and fatigue because often we don't actually get a response at all when we complain. We either get ignored or we get the standard thing saying, oh, we'll pass it on, and we never hear anything. So we get kind of tired of complaining after a while because it doesn't seem to make any change.
I can understand that must be quite frustrating. But I think, yeah, the point is just to do it anyway and hope that somebody
yeah it's and sometimes we discover things that honestly we would have never have imagined because we don't one of the things is you can never quite always imagine the way that people are going to use the equipment that they've got. It's not the equipment itself, it's not even understanding the equipment, but human beings are really creative in the way that they cobble together different systems and processes and they almost create their own user experience of your content, and it gives us, it's really, really good. And sometimes change doesn't happen overnight, but it's all good data and deliver it as, by the way, this is my experience, and I think you need to know that. It's try not to think about it as complaining and try and create a dialogue.
Great. We have two questions that have come through, or three questions that have come through on the chat. So the first one is, with an organisation with a wider footprint of products, can the accessibility guidelines be generic, or is it idle to review the accessibility requirements for each product separately?
Who wants to be brave and take that one?
Can you re-say it again? Somewhere in the middle of it, my head melted.
No, that's all right. So
you.
to paraphrase it shorter, it would be saying if you've got a lot of products, rather than kind of reviewing the guidelines generically across your wide footprint of products, or do you look at them each one separately and review it?
I think it can.
Yeah. Go on, Tamsin.
Well, I think it can only be done separately, but then apply consistently across your products. And you can't, I mean, when you are auditing websites, you don't look at every single page anyway, let alone every single product. You're looking at a selection of pages, you know, auditing and making sure that they're right. And so, you know, the work then applying that same pattern across the website gradually. But it would be impossible to do everything all at once. It's just that what you're doing needs to be consistently done across all the products.
Yeah, totally agree with that. But then again, there is stuff that is specific to specific audiences. So if we're designing something for, say, for instance, for World Service, which is going out in the South Sudan, it's going to be a very, very different audience to the under sixes in the UK. You know, we have to approach accessibility there's so many different lenses to it, which are specific to different product types, to their audiences and the context that their audiences are accessing that on. So we have, for World Service, we have a very different view of accessibility because we're looking at developing nation technologies to something would be bbc.com, which will go in Europe and North America predominantly, which has a very Western view of a perspective of technology and an opportunity for the audiences. So you have to think about things in a slightly different way in the context of the users and the equipment that they have access to. But again, the under sixes, none of them using assistive technology pretty much, and they're also, you've got to think about the under six audiences are also, a lot of them, the carers come from their grandparents. So you've got to make it age-related accessible and accessible to the under sixes, and think about the consistency all at the same time. But it's doable. It is doable. It just takes a bit of thought.
Can you give an example of, accessibility for a 6-year-old and accessibility in, Sudan? Like,
so in South, so the world, so some of the more difficult regions that we broadcast in, you are looking at, basically you're looking at things that are freeware. You're looking at stuff that is a lot of legacy platforms, feature phones rather than sort of iPhones and stuff like that. You're really looking at a progressive enhancement in its purest form. Yes, and you're also you have to think about socio-economic accessibility as well, because then you have to make everything really light, served as locally as possible, as data efficient as possible. And you've got to then still fit in all of the multimodality. And so there's some places where the news app, the data is so expensive, the application actually makes a phone call and the audio is delivered down the phone line via the application because it's cheaper than mobile data. And so you've got to think, because this could be 10 times the cost that we're paying for data for people who earn, 50 times less than we do. And so you've got to think about all those kind of rights around accessibility. And with kids, that's a totally different thing. So all kids have accessibility needs because they're all at different stages of development and they're all developing in slightly different ways. And so, everything is read along, everything works in a way that everything that's displayed visually also has to have an audio equivalent. So everything you click on, every kind of bit of discovery, it gives something that unique that also gives you that information. You think about touch screens because you make everything around the edge of the touch screen not interactable because kids have a tendency of grabbing the screens. You look at their physical way and you watch the way that they play. You go to different types of schools and watch the way children interact. I mean, something I was kind of lucky because I kind of grew up My father actually ran a school which was a residential school for kids with really complex needs, and they all lived there, and they were my friends from the age of 2. But we also had great connections with the blind school. But you watch blind kids playing, they don't run around. They don't. Free explore is a difficult thing. And so you build in that opportunity of free explorer, and you give encouragement around it. And games for children have a no fail mode. So no matter what you do, something fun happens and there's an interaction and you help them build skills. There's so many different things, but you think about children when you're building children's stuff. You don't think about guidelines. Start with the kids and start with the people in the difficult regions, and then work towards it and find what the guidelines can enable you to do. It's not a box ticking exercise.
Thank you.
Yeah, awesome. So we have a question from Steve, and this is directed for everyone. And the question is, what's the most important thing that we can do to help our organizations move from a compliance, we have to do this mindset, to a, hey, this is good design and important kind of mindset?
I think Gareth just answered it, actually. Think about your audience. Know your audience.
I would suggest the best way is to get management to watch people trying to use your content, access it. When they see that, something happens. That's the aha moment. When they see it's how broken it is.
Sorry, Carl, go on.
I was going to say one thing that's always good to put into context is that if we stop thinking about it as a compliance thing and as we're trying to help our customers thing, like think of them as people, not just a box that we need to check off, but really these are people that are interacting with the systems that we designed, that are really doing the things that they want to be able to. So for example, as I mentioned before, I work at a bank, so these are people who want to be able to do their banking, and it's not a like I said, it's not a checkbox. These are real people, and sometimes putting a face to and kind of just going off what you were saying in terms of putting a face to the story, to say, hey, Joe here is can't log in because the login page doesn't interact with the screen reader very well. That's alarm bells, right? Because all of a sudden that's somebody who can't use your system.
Yep.
Yeah, totally agree with that. It's moving their mindset from worthy to worthwhile. It's constantly the problem with accessibility is the word, because it's such a loaded word. You kind of take the baggage with it, and you kind of have to, unfortunately people see it and go, it's a nice thing to do. It's not a nice thing to do. Just we just want everyone to access it, but there actually is so much opportunity in there. And contextualize it to them. Just say, look, if you do that, you get a free SEO improvement. It improves all our access through social media. It improves our user engagement. It actually makes things more robust. So if stuff fails, we don't end up serving up blank pages. And put all of the other stuff that comes in and just go, you want all of that. So if we do accessibility, you get all that for free. And so they start turning around and going, hang on a minute, this is self-financing because of all of this great additional stuff that comes in. And at the same time, that enables us to be more inclusive and reach more of an audience and put that face to it. I think the first thing, I used to make TV trails for the BBC. That's where I joined it. I used to, I came from a creative background, and the first thing I made was a film of users who were all pro BBC, who were all struggling with it, just going, I just want to find the arches. What's going on? There's a list of 300 things here. I know it's accessible to me, but I've got to listen to all of them. Sit here and listen with me as I go through them all, because of the way you've marked it up. And it is useful. Tell the story.
I hate to interrupt because we could probably go on all evening, but I think that's going to be a wrap for this evening. So I'd like to just send a huge thank you to our panelists for the time and effort that you've put into presenting some really, really interesting and inspirational thoughts and ideas. So there was a lot of information posted in the chat channels, which we will make available, a lot of resources. We will post that onto our meetup page. And that's it. That's a wrap. So I'd like to thank Sarah, who made this possible, doing the technical host. I'd like to thank Lauren for facilitating the Q&A and being a fantastic support in the meetup. And that's a wrap. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
So
you,
just
everyone,
want
for
to
inviting me.
thank the live
Thanks, everyone.
captioners as well.
Sorry, yeah, last but not least.
And Zoe, who has pretty much done the
Yes.
hard work for this whole thing.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
thanks, Zoe.
Thank you so
Cool.
much.
Thanks a lot.
I
Thanks,
will be in touch with a post-webinar, what did I call it? Drinks and debrief.
Sounds good.
Awesome.
Yeah, Zoe, would you be able to share the questions as well so we could have a look at them again? I see comments and questions and I haven't had time to read them all.
Yes, I think all that's saved, so we will share that as well.
It's 9:30 in the morning, too early for drinks.
Never.
Oh, Australia.
Well, it's drinks time somewhere else in the world, right? We'll just adjust.
That's good. I'll buy that.
In time.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, everybody, and have a wonderful evening.
You
Thanks,
too.
everyone.
Thank you very much.
You guys are awesome.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Nice to meet
Bye
you.
now.